Hello everyone, my name is Shai and I'm going to present to you a study that Professor Yoav Mekel and myself performed about repeated jump ability of young basketball players at different game stages and its relationship to aerobic capacity. Basketball is a team sport that characterized by intense intermittent activity. In this sport, we can see a lot of sprints, jumps, changes of directions, and short break times like timeouts, penalty shots, and breaks between the quarters. Lots of studies examined physiological responses that running or cycling are the exercise mode. However, in basketball, one of the main types of action is vertical jumping. So we thought that it's important to measure the activity of jumping among basketball players. Let's have a look on the importance of jumping.
Rebounded by Favors. And mind over the points and everything else. Just watch this. See, he lets him get a half ahead of him, and then so there's no body contact on the hip. Wow. He doesn't see it.
Second side phase on the block, nice big dish. Blocked by Howard. Five to shoot. Inside Moody. Put it up, big fella. Blocked again.
Okay, the traditional repeated activity tests were performed at most when the participants were fresh and prepared themselves. But in basketball, the players are required to perform high intensity movements throughout the entire game. Then it seems that the regular activity tests are irrelevant to evaluating capabilities of basketball players at the advanced stages of the game. The purpose of the study was to compare performances indices and physiological responses following repeated jump tests, RJTs, at different stages of basketball game. Before a game, following a regular warm-up, at halftime, after warm-up, and when the players played half of a basketball game, and at the end of a game. Additionally, we want to examine the relationships between aerobic fitness and the performance indices of repeated jump tests at different stages of the game, before, at halftime, and at the end of a game. For the study, we recruited 14 young basketball players. Each participant performed 4 tests. The first one was the aerobic power test, the yo-yo test. This test is popular among team sport coaches because of the back and forward run that characterize players' movement patterns during games. The test involves the shuttle runs between 2 markers that are 20 meters apart at elevated speed. The score for each participant was decided according to the total distance gained before terminating the run. The 3 repeated jump tests at different stages of basketball game were performed after a warm-up, at halftime, and at the end of a game, each on a separate day. The repeated jump test protocol included 6 sets of 6 consecutive maximal jumps, the free counter movement jumps, with 30 seconds rest between sets. For each repeated jump test, we measured 3 indices. The first one was the ideal jump height. It was computed as the highest jump in each set multiplied by 6. The second one is the total jump height, the total of all jumping heights in all sets. And the third one was the performance decrement, the percent decrement of height during the 36 jumps. Heart rate and RPE responses were collected before and at the end of each test. Statistical analysis. ANOVA for repeated measures to determine differences between ideal and total jump height, performance decrement, heart rate, and RPE following RJT after warm-up, at halftime, and at the end of a game. Pearson correlations were computed between aerobic capacity and the performance indices in the three different RJTs. Results. The results show that compared with the after warming up RJT performance indices, the RJT performance indices increased substantially after halftime. However, after a full-time game, the RJT's performance indices were significantly lower than the RJTs after a halftime, but unchanged compared to the warm-up RJT's performance indices. To try to understand the reason for the considerably higher IG and TJ performance indices, we might want to look more carefully at the performance indices after a warm-up, as well as the specific preparation of the players before each of the two RJTs. The warm-up procedure in this study, which players normally performed routinely before a basketball game, lasted about 25 to 30 minutes. The majority of this warm-up focused on technical drills, such as passing, dribbling, and shooting the ball. This indicates that during the warm-up, the players perform only low-intensity activity that prepare them mainly for specific basketball skills. It therefore is doubtful whether the low-intensity exercises that comprise the warm-up in the present study can adequately prepare the player's muscles and metabolic systems for the subsequent 36 all-out vertical jumps of the RJT. It may also be possible that such a warm-up is neither long enough nor intense enough to prepare the players for the activity that is expected in the very first minutes of a competitive basketball game. However, coaches should consider that if the players use the first part of the game as a warm-up stage and are not fully prepared for the beginning of the game, it could make the team vulnerable. Therefore, it seems that coaches and players should consider the use of longer and more intense warm-up procedure, including short sprints and jumping exercise prior to the beginning of a basketball game. The significant reduction in the ideal and total jump height performance indices at the end of a game compared to these performance indices at halftime probably demonstrated the accumulative fatigue effect of the full game activity. Such an accumulative fatigue effect was not seen at halftime compared to the post-warm-up RJT. During any of the three game stages, there was no significant difference in the performance decrement. This present study also examined the relation between aerobic capacity of the players and RJT performance indices in the various stages. No significant relationships were found between aerobic capacity and any of the repeated jump test performance indices at the different game stages. These findings may indicate that repeated jump activity does not profoundly rely or depend on the aerobic system as the main energy supplier for an activity of this nature among young basketball players. Support for this assumption was seen in the findings of two other studies of Meckel et al. At one study, the researchers are examining the RJT and RST repeated sprint test performance indices of professional volleyball players. As in the current study's result, no significant relationship were found between the player's aerobic capacity and any of the performances indices of the RGT following a standard warm-up. However, significant correlations were found in their study between the aerobic capacity and all the performance indices of the repeated sprint test. The second study examined the relationship between the aerobic capacity and the repeated sprint test performance indices of young basketball players. At their study, significant correlations were found between the aerobic capacity and the performance indices, ideal time and total time at halftime and the end of a basketball game. In the volleyball player study, the researchers speculated that the repeated jump test imposes a different physiological stress on the working muscles compared to the repeated sprint test. They proposed that while fatigue in the RST is mainly related to metabolism and CP replenishment in activated muscles, fatigue in the RJT is mainly related to neuromuscular system functioning and to the muscle's contraction mechanism. Conclusions. The higher RJT performance indices at halftime compared to those following the warm-up procedure may indicate a need for a more efficient preparation process prior to the beginning of a basketball game. The significant reduction in the ideal jump and total jump height performance indices at the end of a game compared to performance indices at halftime probably demonstrate the accumulative fatigue effect of the full game activity. The lack of significant correlations between the aerobic capacity and any of the RGT performance indices at all the game stages could imply that jump activities do not rely profoundly on the aerobic system as the main energy supplier for young basketball players. Thank you very much for listening. Is there any questions?